Welcome to Narrative Arc, the journey from writer to reader. I'm Danielle Ofri, editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review. And when we first conceived of the idea of narrative arc, we were looking for ways to connect our readers to the wonderful stories, poems, and essays they read in the pages of Bellevue Literary Review. And although the term narrative arc typically refers to story structure, we're interpreting it a bit differently because we're fascinated by the entire arc of a piece of writing, from the first sparks of ideas in the writer's head to the first jottings on the page to the submission process, the selection process, editing, publishing, all the way to the moment the reader gets the journal in their hands. They get to open it, smell the journal, read those words, and then sit back and let it all sink in. And for that reason, we put out a call to our readers to ask them, tell us your favorite BLR stories, poems, and essays. And now we're giving those readers a chance to interview the author directly, connecting the ends of the narrative arc. Up first is poetry. Our first reader-writer pairing was a full year in the making. Stacy Nigliazzo is a nurse and a poet who we've published ourselves, but she's also a dedicated BLR reader. And there was this poem she wrote to us about that was published way back in issue 18 of the journal, one of my favorite covers. The poem was called St. Elizabeth, and it never left her. But we were not able to contact the author, Rachel Contreni Flynn. But that didn't stop our reader, Stacy, who was doggedly in pursuit, and she was able to contact her. And so now her persistence paid off. We're able to bring you Rachel and Stacy together for the first time.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Stacy Nigliazzo, and I'm a reader and writer and proud previous contributor to the Bellevue Literary Review. I've invited Rachel Flynn here today to discuss her exquisite poem, St. Elizabeth, which was published in the BLR in 2010 in the contest issue, which I have right here. Incredible issue, still haunted by it all these years later. Rachel, will you please introduce yourself and also read your poem aloud?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to spend time with you and with this poem again. It's been many years since I wrote it. So I'm Rachel Contreni Flynn. I'm a poet and a teacher. And for the past 10 years, I've been the editor at the Poetry Journal. In my day job life, I'm an employment attorney, and I run a small vintage shop as well. So I have my oar in a lot of different waters. I'm also a mom and a sister. We'll get to this in the poem, I'm sure. I come from a big family. I've got 5 siblings. And that comes out in a lot of my poetry, the relationships there. And I'm happy to read this poem. The poem's called St. Elizabeth. A scarecrow came for breakfast, sat in my sister's seat and refused to eat. It combed its straw hair with shredded hands, fluffed its limbs and made chit-chat, happy faces, horrid little predictions. She was blonde and tough and flawless in her flute playing. I thought she played to wake me on winter mornings, the sweet gavotte. I was wrong. She despised the dark animal of me, my dirt set, my clawing, my knotted hair. But the flute told its falsehoods. Then she left as a ghost, coldly, lightly as the gavotte, as birdshot. And me, a possum, caught in the yard at dawn. My sister left for a few weeks and the lid lifted off the stock pot. The house filled with the possibility of eating bread dunked in the savory thickness of her absence. I was happy to sit in the kitchen thinking, happy to carry the baby, a sack of sweet apples against me. She was gone, and I was glad the steel edge of her had stopped carving all the faces in the house into shriveling dolls, gouging eyes out of the simple starch of us. Even the hospital bore her name, called her Saint. I too was sick, of driving and sitting, of nodding. I knew the big building that held her would not heal her. At home, I gathered mulberries in the woods. I told my brother stories in the barn that began, once there was a bag of sadness locked in the attic. Because she harms herself, we're scared into applause. And because she steals everything shiny, a frantic magpie, we creep behind her, silent butlers returning, the lighters, the cufflinks, the neighbors' spoons and coins. Because she forbids us to forbid her, the liquor cabinet, the car crashes, we pray she'll go away like a bit of milkweed silk. Instead, she returns, a dog in pain no one will put down, that stains the carpets and wakes us all night with sharp barks until someone rises to let her out, knowing she won't go, and she won't. The girl lies small, pale, naked, in bright sunlight across a tightly made bed. She ages before my eyes. Bones rise up, legs lengthen, but no hair anywhere except the hay lightness around her head, which turns, and her mouth, the only red in the room, begins to scream. This is my sister, it seems. I close the door and back away. Even in dreams, I back away. I forsake her. I laugh and run. It is too much, the brightness of her and the love. I understand certain things about religion, how it is to continue to believe in the implausible thing. As a child, I only wanted my sister's body against me in sleep. Even now, I dream of her breath in my hair. I wake feeling saved, then bitten and torn down.
So incredible. And it's really powerful to hear you read that poem, Rachel. Thank you. And as I said before, I've been haunted by the issue, that 2010 contest issue of the BLR, and hooked particularly on this poem since I first read it all those years ago. So much that I've worked it into my curriculum at Baylor College of Medicine, where I teach healthcare humanities to medical students and internal medicine residents as part of the Humanities Expression and Arts Lab. And the students always have a lot to say about it. And my first question for you is, what inspired this poem?
This poem came from that section 6, the dream, which is, I think, pretty much an exact replication of a dream that I had, as a grown up, working on this collection, this book that has a lot to do with my sister. It's in fact dedicated to her, to my older sister. That section 6, the dream with the girl who ages and lengthens on a tightly made bed, was kind of a nightmare that I had. And I woke up and I was so shaken by it, mostly shaken by the fact that I ran away, that I didn't want to, leap forward and help this person protect, engage with the sister figure at all. And so I felt like that was something I kind of needed to plumb and to pick at and understand why in the dream I had that reaction, and why I had those guilt feelings of not being more present.
As far as the construction of this poem is concerned, you have 7 numbered sections, and you have lots of different forms here, such as tercets, single-line stanzas, couplets, and prose poems. So my next question is, what drove these choices for you?
For me, form follows function. The shape of a poem, the line length, the stanza configuration seems to suit at least two things. One is the breath, the manner of breathing that I'm experiencing and want to sort of enact for the reader. The other thing is the appearance of that chunk of language. I want it to look like, this is very synesthesia-ish.
I love it.
I want it to look like the emotion that I'm trying to convey. I want the line lengths and such to reflect that and enact that.
This poem was written about someone that you love, someone close to you. Talk a little bit about that, if you would. What is it like when you're writing about someone you love, especially a difficult experience that they're going through?
Well, I'll start answering that, I hope, with my favorite image. And I think probably my favorite image here is the one where the speaker is gathering mulberries in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
And mulberries for me are a pretty powerful image because they are two things at once. So within the mulberry, you have something that is sweet and lovely. It's purplish, but it is also something, first of all, that stains.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, if you don't hit it correctly, it's dangerous. So I think that image kind of calls to me because this poem about my relationship with my sister circles around those kind of collisions of what is dangerous and beloved, and consistently trying to navigate that juxtaposition. Because with my sister, I, for many years was afraid for her and her illness, but I was also afraid of her.
Wow.
And within that, I was afraid of her power within the family and, within me. But I was also afraid of her weakness, her physical weakness, which was very dangerous to her. So layer upon layer, these, these juxtapositions and how these conflicting emotions can exist at the same time in the same stanza within a life, within a relationship. And so I think that's one of the things that this poem is trying to do, is to smash the adoration and the terror against each other.
I love how you're calling it the adoration and the terror, the dangerous and the beloved. I absolutely felt that when I read this poem. And that's one of the reasons why I think it stuck with me all these years, is because I believed it was so honest. And it's so hard to talk about the terror. And it's so hard to talk about what's dangerous, especially in terms of someone that you love. And it's such a brave poem. And yeah, hearing you talk about that, really, it just reminds me of why I love this poem so much. I'm so proud to have been a part of this collaboration here today, and so glad that I found this poem. And I want to thank you for sharing it with the readers of the Bellevue Literary Review, and also personally with me, because it's meant so much.
Yes, and thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Rachel. I love the conversation about imagery. So much we can learn as writers and so much we can relish as readers. Next, we'll turn to nonfiction. And we hear from reader Anyika Jordan, who is a BLR board member and a devoted BLR reader. She was so touched by the essay, A Love Story All the Same, from BLR issue 47, that she was dying to talk with its author, Claire Berman. And so here they are.
I want to welcome you, Claire Berman. Thank you very much for contributing your story to our issue 47. The story was very revealing to me about people with chronic illness and your portrayal of the female character and her struggles with the body image and being understood in the doctor's office, as well as the setting, which is in COVID and she's isolated, I found to be all very relevant and relatable. Um, so welcome. Would you like to say something about yourself before we get started?
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be here. My name is Claire Berman. I live in Boston and I'm a writer. I love to write essays and fiction and poetry. And in my day job, I'm a health communicator and I specialize in pediatric HIV. And it's really wonderful to be here.
Would you like to share a little bit about your story?
Yes, I would love to. So I'll start reading from the beginning and then I'll go to a later passage. As he works in my kitchen, Mike tells me about the extraordinary ways mice survive. You wouldn't believe the things I've seen, he says with a hint of incredulity. He tells me of mice scaling smooth walls sideways, of licking oil bottles for sustenance, of taking up residence inside the arms of couches. Mike's easy laugh booms through his cloth mask, which his crinkling brown eyes pull high on his face. He adjusts it often. I ask questions about his work, desperate to prolong this rare human contact. It's a July day, early in an already endless quarantine. Mike can't see, but I'm panting under my mask. It's been months since I got sick with COVID in the panicky first wave of the pandemic, and my body is still recovering. Stony cobwebs weigh down my lungs. Chaotic darts of pain shoot through my heart. There are mouse traps everywhere in my apartment, but the mice seem wholly unbothered by them. They lick the traps clean and scamper into my wall, down to the bowels of the basement. It feels as though the traps are laid for me instead. As I pace my lonely apartment, I occasionally brush up against one, and it snaps into the empty air, making my pulse race in my ears. Almost ashamed to kill mice as smart as these, Mike quips in a thick and familiar Boston accent. I watch the top of his head as he kneels and plugs a hole behind my stove. His weathered forehead softens into curvy waves of jet black hair. He uses a thin rod to stuff bundles of steel wool into my wall and then grimaces, pulling himself up and stretching his broad shoulders. Are you okay? I ask. Bad back, he says, and a migraine. I'm sorry, I get those too. The worst, he says, bending again over a mousetrap. Had 'em since I was a kid. He glances over his shoulder at me. You? Mine started when I was 20. I had one almost every day my senior year in college. Out of breath from so many words, I pause, arch my neck, and use my shoulders to breathe. I'm writing a character who gets them. No kidding, I write too, he says, suddenly shy. I mean, nothing real yet. I mostly write a lot of notes in my phone. What do you write about? He thinks for a moment, the mousetrap suspended in his hand and ready to snap. I guess the crux of it is, how do you go on living when there's no hope for a cure for what you have? That same summer of the mice, when I am well acquainted with my bed and couch, but not much else, a friend recommends a romance novel about a woman with a chronic illness. By this time, the energy for any activity, even reading, is something I must carefully budget. Slowly, pausing often to rest, I begin. The heroine is Chloe, a young woman with fibromyalgia and medication patches hidden under her clothes. She rarely leaves the house, and the messiness in her home corresponds directly with her level of pain. Her apartment is her comfortable retreat, but also the place she struggles to escape. The title of the book, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, speaks to her goal. As someone with a chronic illness, she wants to learn how to live her young adult life and thrive with the body she's got. When a handsome repairman appears at her door, It sets off an enemies to lovers arc. A major part of Chloe's story is her struggle to be forthright about her pain and to trust him with the truth. So now I'll skip ahead, and what I'm skipping over is having many visits from Mike, the exterminator, who returns over and over to attempt to rid me of the mice, as I'm also navigating many healthcare appointments and trying to find some treatment that will work for my long COVID. And all of this is happening as I'm slowly reading this romance novel and Chloe's story. Between Mike's visits, while the mice are busy gnawing through my freshly sealed walls, I think of Chloe. It isn't just her finding someone who loves her that is so powerful. It's that nothing about her illness has to change for her to receive real love. I read the book curled on my couch, unable to walk further than my kitchen or even sit up some days. Clutter builds up around me until I have a bout of energy to clean, which in turn prompts the need to rest. I think about the many years I settled for anyone who would accommodate my body's dysfunctions, anyone who would tolerate my physical shortcomings, even if there were no other signs of love. I was sure I needed a different body, a better body, to be loved. It isn't easy for Chloe either, but when she and her beau finally get their happy ending, her pain patches are still there underneath her clothes, just like before. She's managing it, and she is living. She's the first character I've come across whose chronically ill body doesn't need to change at all before she can be lovable. The only thing that needed changing was her acceptance. She is a revelation.
That was wonderful. And so let's begin with Mike. Mike is an exterminator. He's the only person you're seeing. And you all are able to have these moments of human connection that really open up a new world, not just about the life of mice, but also just sort of that everyone has pain and illness and hopes. And for instance, Mike writes, but also Mike has the back pain, but he's still working. How did your character relate to Mike in a way that the relationship became so instrumental to the protagonist's growth?
Mike's question that he poses within his own writing, to me, felt so brilliant and profound and vulnerable. His question of how do you go on living when there's no hope for a cure for what you have? And I think for me, what it did was it opened up such an unexpectedly deep connection. I was expecting sort of a routine exterminator visit that would not last very long because, it's always the time crunch when folks are working. And I kind of imagine that Mike also felt some isolation as well. He was going into homes and everyone was masking, and he said people were staying in the other room. And so he also wasn't getting the same contact that he was used to. And so he may have also been craving some of these long visits and conversation. And I think Mike's question to me was sort of an affirmation that he really deeply understood this experience of chronic illness. I met him when I was very much in the throes of long COVID before I had seen any improvement in my symptoms. And I think that his question really signaled to me that he was someone who could understand this experience on some level and that he wouldn't try to fix me. And, I think that it was so vulnerable of him really to do that. And it opened up such a beautiful connection and very affirming connection that I think we both needed in that moment.
Yes. And it was lovely the way the exchange was very short, but yet so full of everything, and so many words and thoughts and things to contemplate. And so moving on to the protagonist reading this book about Chloe Brown. I always find it, really enthralling when I read a book and I can relate really strongly with the character. And that seems to be the case with your main character and the character in the book. So when Chloe Brown, I guess, has the happy ending, and your character has the big revelation that she can be loved, and that beauty and illness can be synonymous, or at least, agreeable. What did that, when you were writing that as an author, what were you trying to get across to the reader?
Um, Part of why I started uh, focusing on a romance novel was that, in the class when we were speaking about mythic memoir and using mythology as a backbone to a story, it didn't occur to me until much later that we could consider romance novels to be a type of mythology as well, and one that within our culture is pretty prominent. I would say, whether we're readers of romance novels or not, there, at least for me, I have often felt sort of um, this sort of like happy ever after uh, myth as something that can feel like a lot of pressure. And so, for me, being able to kind of think about um, a character in that position of being an actual heroine of a romance novel was pretty revelatory, considering that she had a body like mine. And it wasn't about looks, even. It was much more deep than that for me. It was much more about how my body functions and the way that I can feel. Inside my own body that can be pretty major blocks for me. And so, it wasn't until I sort of started thinking about it in that framework that the pieces of this essay finally came together. And I felt like I had written something that I was actually pretty scared to write.
Writing can be challenging. I agree. But I believe that you really encompass so many beautiful thoughts. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the title, A Love Story All the Same, and what you thought about when you created that title as a reflection of this totality of the story.
The expectation and promise of a romance novel is that the love interests will always get together at the end and they'll have a happy ending. And happy ending meaning that they find romantic love with each other. But for me, the story with Mike was about so much more than just romantic love. A lot of my friends were teasing me relentlessly this whole time, and wondering, why we weren't dating, and kind of framing his visits as like, well, he's staying a long time at each visit, it must mean. But I think that for me, when I think about the idea of love, I really think about giving compassionate attention. And I think that's really what unites all of the threads in my essay. For me, is this idea of compassionate attention as a form of love. Mike and I gave that to each other, in a deeply isolating time. We were both masked. I never saw his whole face once this whole time. And yet he gave me such a rare gift, which was this gift of time and compassionate attention, as we talked about our shared experiences of illness, our love of writing, and about mice. I mean, half the stories Mike told me about mice didn't even make it into the essay. But we just, I think we really gave that to each other. I think Talia Hibbert, who's the author of Get a Life, Chloe Brown, she gives Chloe as a character that, and gives us as readers compassionate attention as she, creates this beautiful novel that centers a really, I think, realistic experience of chronic illness. The breathing specialist who eventually helps me, towards the end of my essay, gives me that too. It's something that as a female patient, it can it doesn't always feel like a guarantee to receive that, and she gives that to me. And just the act of giving that kind of compassion in a healthcare setting and believing me, I think was an act of love. And to me, then these are the lessons that I tried to carry forward when I finally turned towards my own body at the end. And I'm able to sort of from the inside out see it as more than just a failure of society's beauty standards, and maybe more than, the way that I've sometimes felt, that it doesn't function the way I want to. And I was able to really turn compassionate attention towards my body and finally, kind of find a sense of beauty there for how hard it tries and what it's able to
Absolutely.
do.
Absolutely. It was definitely a love story. It was really, really a beautiful story. Thank you for being a part of the Bellevue Literary Review. We are honored to have you in issue 47.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual.
Oh, I was still reading along. Thank you, Anyika and Claire. I really appreciate the emphasis on connection. This is what drives all great writing, and I think also what keeps writers really gripped and absorbed in the writing. And this is why there are stories, poems, and essays that, from years ago that we never forget. They kind of take up residence somewhere in our brains, kind of like mice, but maybe that's a metaphor too far. Anyway, but along the narrative arc, there are actually many readers before we get to you, the actual reader. And I'm speaking now about the BLR reviewers, that stalwart group of readers who go through and parse through the some 5,000 submissions we get every year at BLR. And it's their initial readings that push these writings along the narrative arc. And so we're pleased to bring you a peek behind the curtain to meet a few of our reviewers to give some observations about their spot on the narrative arc.
One piece of advice I've always appreciated is that our stories live inside our bodies. And what happens to our bodies, whether in sickness or otherwise, is as intimate to our identity as how we speak, what we wear, how we move, how we present ourselves to the world. So this one elemental truth informs a lot of my approach to reviewing for BLR, but it's true of all writing generally, that the things we experience are not simply discrete moments in time, but events we carry with us at the very core of our beings to experience and re-experience again and again. And your narrative arc, wherever you decide to take it, must always bend toward that truth, toward the truth of the body, toward the lived urgency of the body, toward connection over conclusion. Because, to quote the Barbie movie, people only have one ending. The ending isn't really what matters. And what happens to us isn't simply about what happens to you. In fact, if you're most people, your story is about the things you turn away from. It's about the shadows you avoid, those private agonies and ineffable joys that cause you to flinch or sink or pick up your pace. And if it seems incredibly daunting as a writer to have to try and capture all of this yourself, consider asking yourself the following. Where is there pain for you? And where does it happen? When does it happen? Try to notice that. Where are you owed an explanation? And how are you revealed in your own reactions? If you can answer any one of those things as you set out to write, then you are further along the narrative arc than if you just sat down and plotted the whole thing from start to finish. But there's so much more to it than just that. So as a reviewer for BLR, I'm usually reading subject matter that exists far outside my own lived experience. I am otherwise an able-bodied cis male with no background in medicine or healthcare, no history of addiction or chronic illness, and at this very moment of my life, very little experience as a caregiver. But often, when I review submissions, I'm reminded of something Alan de Botton had to say about how one kind of good book should leave you asking, how did the author know that about me? This is the essence of connection. Most writers are never going to be able to experience it with the reader in real time. It's part of what makes our work so challenging and, yes, lonely. But looked at another way, the act of emotional connection is fundamentally an act of surprise. And that is more important to me as a reviewer than any plot point, any story spine, any inciting event, any formalistic approach to technique. The real work is always in the urgency, it's in the stakes, it's in going to where the heat is. Because if you don't feel that heat as you write, if you don't interrogate it in yourself at every step of the process, your reader isn't going to feel it either. This is what I teach my own students at Writer Studio, and it's the lens I carry with me as a reviewer for BLR.
I'm Theresa Brown, nurse and writer. As a reviewer for the Bellevue Literary Review, being a nurse gives me a boots on the ground perspective, and about every submission I ask myself, is this story true? Does it feel real? Every submission I read also has a moment of unexpectedness. So a story about a dinner party might become a parable about grief. An essay about disability might make me think in a new way about what ordinary life means and what's possible. A story about a long nighttime car ride where the driver's crossing state borders and going into the dark might have layers of disappointment, but also hope. I love this unexpectedness because it reminds me that when writing about healthcare or illness, the stories need to be layered and complex. That's what makes them feel real and true. The thing I love about reviewing for the BLR is that in every submission, the author is looking for some kind of healing. Might be healing from a loss, or an illness, or just something unexpected and dark. The point is, they want to feel better. I find that poignant, but also inspiring. It gets me to put more caring into the world, and it reminds me always to put healing into my own writing.
Thank you, Hani and Theresa. Lastly, we will turn to fiction. And our reader for fiction is Allie Nava, who is a BLR board member and also a writer. In fact, her debut novel just came out, July and Everything After. And the story that Allie couldn't get out of her head is Revolutions in Time by Elizabeth Lee, published in BLR issue 44. And dropping in at the end, we'll get a perspective from BLR's associate fiction editor, Doris W. Cheng, who edited the story with Elizabeth Lee. Just one more point along that narrative arc.
Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I was especially excited to hear that we would have a chance to interview you. I was personally very moved by your story, Revolutions in Time. So again, we're super excited to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Allie. It's an honor to be here. I am currently a graduate student at the University of Michigan pursuing an MFA in fiction. Previously, I worked as a software engineer, but right now I'm focusing on writing.
And how about this story, Revolutions in Time, that appeared in issue 44 of Bellevue Literary Review? What inspired that particular story?
Yeah, that story came to mind when I was still an undergrad in college, and I was living in New York at the time, and the Atlanta shootings had just happened. It was in March 2021, and I was seeing so much on social media and the news about the people the victims in that shooting. And there were, I believe 6 out of 8 of them were Asian women. And I remember just feeling so distanced from that violent act. And I wanted to explore it more deeply. I was seeing a lot of messages and asks for help from the families of those victims. And I wanted to explore it more closely to those lives and focus more on the aftermath of these violent acts, and sort of personalize and individualize these people who had this terrible thing happen to them.
Well, I'm really looking forward to diving into this story with you. I'm a huge fan of what you've written and how you've written it. Maybe we can start with having you read an excerpt first.
So this story is in 3 parts. Each one is a sort of mini story exploring a family of who has lost a loved one in a shooting, and I'll go ahead and read the opening from the first section. My mother looks so beautiful when she hasn't yet birthed me. Despite the spotty glow of the traffic lights, her beauty is noticeable. She is still young and doesn't know postpartum depression, sleepless nights shredded by my wails, white suburban mother's pursed red lips as she picks me up from school in her laundromat clothes. She is so beautiful, refreshing, like cool water in parched summer heat. She is lovely, like dewdrops in early morning light. She is strong, like a waterfall in constant radiance. I lean against the bus stop sign, watching her, waiting, aching. I want to touch her, the cuff of her work sleeve, the 50-cent claw clip clasping her unruly hair, the solid warmth of her middle, hold her there in the middle of the street, never let her go. Amma, I missed you. Amma, it's me, Miriam. I'm here to save you. Amma. It was rainy when she drove to pick me up from church. I had been behaving badly lately, sneaking out at night, drinking at parties, foregoing my homework, and it was showing under my eyes and on my report card. She caught me climbing back in through my window one morning and sentenced me to a month-long grounding and signed me up to volunteer at the Southern Virginia Korean Presbyterian Church fundraiser the following weekend. I was pretty sure she'd promised Hani my help anyway, and the punishment was just an easy excuse to force me into it. I was on daycare duty in one of those tiny preschool rooms with bright Noah's Ark animals plastered on the walls, so I wasn't in the gymnasium, which was where it happened. But it hasn't happened yet. It won't happen for 17 more years. Right now, in the beforehand, when I don't exist yet, she's crossing the street to catch the bus home. She's got a satchel that holds her sewing kit and an empty lunchbox. Her clothes are a baggy linen that falls limply on her thin figure, and her hands look 10 years older than the rest of her. 17 years from now, when she walks into the church gymnasium, her face will have deeper lines and her cheeks will be sallow. The bags beneath her eyes will be on the front page of the national newspapers, which will be strewn across our kitchen table, covering half-empty casserole dishes, and the inky print will be smeared with minutes-old tears. But she doesn't know that, not right now. She doesn't know the man following her who spends his nights browsing videos of Asian women with slim feet moaning about daddy. She doesn't know that in 5 years he will be incarcerated for second-degree rape, but that will be too late for her and many other women. She will have a baby, mournfully, hatefully, lovefully. She will sing to the child and worry for the child's safety, and the child will not care. She will hear a thump in the night as the child shimmies through the window, scantily clad and too drunk to know which way is up, and her heart will break in 1,000 ways. She will look for her child at the fundraiser in the church gymnasium and instead find the barrel of a gun and the face of a man who has had a bad day. I'm not supposed to be here in this time, in the beforehand. The child doesn't exist yet. But that man was not supposed to be in the church gymnasium, and this man is not supposed to follow my mother, and why are they allowed to exist?
It's beautiful. It's such a moving opening. And having read the story a number of times, the whole piece is moving. The way you've structured the story, it's so creative. First of all, why did you structure it the way you did in sort of these 3 very distinct and different parts?
I wrote the first part as actually an assignment for a class I was taking at the time, and it was to kind of mimic a book, the timeline of a book, and structure a story the same way. So I borrowed the structure of They Will Drown in Their Mother's Tears, which is a Swedish translated novel by Johannes Onyuru. And I just found that timeline so amazing in the way that it can interrogate just the past and this yearning to go back and change the past. So that was my first story, and it came out very short, and I felt that there was still more to explore with this story, but I also felt like Miriam's time on the page was at its end. And I think in any sort of situation like this, where you have so many different families, it's important to spotlight just the differences in them and how each family's grief is different in its own way. It's unique. And so I wanted to look at other families as well and kind of portray this multitude and variousness of Asian lives through my story. And that's how this idea to have multiple parts, each one focusing on a different family, came about.
Yeah, it's the story is very rich with a lot of different themes. There's some commonality, there's some differences. Talk to me about some of the themes. Like as I read it, I saw themes around motherhood, religion, poverty, violence, expectations, luck. Tell us your thoughts and what you were trying to do as you were writing this story.
Yeah. So this was happening at a time when I was really paying attention to violence against Asian bodies. I was living in New York at the time, and it was during an uptick of violent actions on the subway and on the streets of New York in response to COVID. And especially following the shooting in Atlanta, I remember whenever I was talking to my parents on the phone, they live in a very homogeneously white area. So I was also worried for their safety as much as they were concerned about mine. And I just remember every time I was calling them, we would sign off and it'd be like, stay safe out there. So it came from me wanting to interrogate these actions of violence and where they're where they're coming from, but rather who's on the receiving end of those and what effects those have on these families. And then in terms of motherhood, obviously, because I had so much concern for my own family, I think it was rooted in that and just the level of care that we have for one another. And I was particularly interested in exploring just the mother's side of things. In the story, in the first story, the mother has sort of sacrificed her life in order to raise her daughter. And I wanted to explore these elements of sacrifice. The daughter then in this story chooses to try to save her mother's life and like sacrifice her own. And I really wanted to explore these reciprocalities of love and sacrifice.
What about the writing process for you? What was it like for you to write this story? Did you go through a lot of iterations? Did you use an editor before you even submitted it?
Yeah, I submitted the first sort of mini story in this triad for a workshop that I was taking in college, and I got a lot of good feedback just on clarifying the timeline because it can get very convoluted when you're playing around with time. The other two was mostly my own work. I had sort of these ideas. I wanted to center different family members and different family dynamics for each one. So in the first one, it's a single mother and her daughter. In the second, we have your sort of nuclear family with the mother and father and two daughters, and the father is the one who becomes the victim. In the third one, we have another single mother, but her sister is staying with the mother's son and daughter and sort of serves as a caregiver for them. So I had these sorts of different families mapped out, and I really wanted to play off of their dynamics with one another. And it was a pretty smooth drafting process once I had those sort of juxtaposing characters, but it was a process to get it all on the page.
And how has your writing evolved or changed maybe since writing this? And what was the experience of getting it published in Bellevue Literary Review? Like, how was that for you?
It was one of the best experiences I've had. I worked with Doris Cheng, and she was just such a lovely editor. She knew what I was trying to do with the piece, and we had really good conversations about what was on the page and how I wanted it to come across. So it was just a wonderful experience through and through. And to get to have my story published and share it with more people, it was really important to me, especially given the time that I was writing it in and the time that we still find ourselves in now. I find it still very relevant and true.
So as you move forward now with your writing, you said you're completing an MFA. Where do you see yourself going with your writing moving forward, and are you working on anything else at this moment in time?
Yeah, at this moment, I'm working on 2 big projects. So I'm trying to finish a short story collection on the themes of violence against women and people of color, and just to give this sort of diversity of experience, again, of Asian American lives. And I'm also working on a sort of surrealist experimental novel about a young professional woman who's getting kind of sucked into a tech giant, but it's a very Wonderland sort of world. Things are not the way they seem inside.
Well, great. I look forward to hearing more about that, and I know that Bellevue Literary Review looks forward to hearing more about the things that you're doing in the future as well. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us and talk to us a little bit more about your short story, Revolutions in Time, that appears in issue 44 of Bellevue Literary Review. And congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Allie, and thanks for this conversation. This is great.
I'm Doris W. Cheng, Associate Fiction Editor for Bellevue Literary Review. Revolutions in Time was one of the most memorable stories that I've worked on as an editor. When I first read it, I remember being struck by just how bold of an approach it was taking. It's a story that opens with a first-person narrator who is looking back on a moment before she herself has been born, and she's watching her mother in the moments before her mother is assaulted. And she knows that in 17 years, her mother's life will end. It's such a formally innovative move, and it worked so well to create a sense of timelessness in the story. The sense that there's this omniscient and compassionate narrator who's standing outside of time, observing this moment in history. This is a narrator who sees the entirety of it all. Like when she says her mother will look for her child at the fundraiser in the church gymnasium and instead find the barrel of a gun in the face of a man who has had a bad day. It's a narrator who knows that in the future, pain and suffering lie ahead, and despite knowing this, she wants so desperately to change the outcome. I really loved how this story moved from family to family, showing the rippling impact of one racist and violent act. Even though it's a broad perspective, the characters are drawn with so much specificity and care. We see the rebellious child of a single mother, the daughter who remembers her father through music, and a girl whose beloved aunt comes to visit her after death. That was really powerful to me, the way that Elizabeth responded to what was happening in the world, specifically the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021 and the violence against AAPI people that was escalating in the United States. She brought these Asian characters and families to life with so much love and humanity. In terms of the editing process, Elizabeth is such a talented writer on a line level that it really was about paying attention to the story's sense of time and making sure that there was nothing that would trip the reader up or be confusing to them. As we can tell from the title, the chronology isn't linear, but it's circular, and the narrative is recursive in the way that memory is recursive. It moves forward, it looks back, and it circles back around itself. So while the story's form is its great strength, it's also a source of potential confusion. And I didn't want any confusion to detract from the story's emotional power, so we paid a lot of attention to clarifying exactly when things were occurring and making sure the reader always knew exactly where and when they were in the story. We also worked on making sure there were signposts in place for cultural references that the reader might not be familiar with. In the end, I'm so proud of how Revolutions in Time came together. It's such a powerful and moving story, and I'm so honored to have been a part of bringing it to a wider readership. And I really hope you'll give it a read.
Thank you, Allie and Elizabeth, and thank you, Doris. As readers, we rarely have the chance to talk directly to the writers who capture our hearts. Lord knows I would love to dial up Gabriel Garcia Marquez or James Baldwin. I have so many questions for them. But even if our favorite authors are contemporary and still roam the planet, it's still hard to do. Have you tried dialing up Joyce Carol Oates or Ian McEwan? But here at Bellevue Literary Review, you, the reader, can do it. Just let us know which poem is still needling around the back of your head, which story stays with you even when you try to go to sleep, which essay moved you to tears. Send us a note, and maybe you'll have a chance to talk directly to an author who moved you with their words. Haven't read BLR yet? Well, get your print or digital subscription at blreview.org. Your subscription helps sustain BLR, the writers it publishes, and the readers it nourishes. Thank you to all the readers and writers who joined us this evening, and thanks especially to you, the audience, who came out tonight, and we'll see you at the next event.